So in this talk, I'm going to provide a really brief highlights reel of the 12 years of data on behavioural and physiological mechanisms that underpin the responses of southern African desert birds to high and rising temperatures. And these are data that have been collected by the Hot Birds Research Project team over the last decade and a half, or decade and a bit. And as Andrew was saying, the team is an international collaboration. It's led by Andrew McKechnie, who you've just met at the University of Pretoria, who heads up our physiology work, and I'm heading up the behavioural work, or doing my best with that, at the University of Cape Town, and trying with great difficulty to follow in the very large footsteps of the late and much lived Bill Hockey. So our aim in the Hot Birds Research Project is to understand how birds respond behaviourally and physiologically to climate variables, and what this means for where they can survive now and in the future. So we're looking at the mechanisms that link changes in climate to changes in the range and abundance of birds. And we're working in arid zones, or we've, for the last decade, been working in arid zones in several locations internationally. We've done work in the hot deserts of Central Australia, also in the southwestern USA, and also, of course, in Southern Africa. And because we are here speaking about Africa in this seminar series, that's where I'll be focusing. So why have we largely focused on arid zones for the last 10, 12 years? The reason for that, the reason we started in the arid zone with this research program, is because arid zones are extreme places to live. So many desert organisms exist at their tolerance limits, and they may therefore help us to understand what life can actually cope with at the hot end. The other reason why we're focused on deserts when we began this program is because desert areas are warming really rapidly, so more rapidly than many other areas on Earth as global heating carries on. When I first moved to South Africa, I attended a talk by Andrew McKechnie, and he showed some of the data that I'm going to show to you now on climate warming trends around the world. I've updated these to 2010, but this was the first time I'd really seen the real data on temperature rises globally. And I think that we don't see these data often enough, and that's perhaps part of the reason why we've had such a hard time over the last few decades persuading people of the importance of this issue, global heating issue. So these data here are from a weather station in Yuma, Arizona, which is in the Sonoran Desert. And on the x-axis of this graph, we've got dates from about 1980 through to about 2010. And on the y-axis, the number of days per year that exceed 40 degrees Celsius, which is relevant to us in the Hot Birds Research Program, because 40 degrees is roughly the body temperature of birds. You can see that there's a very strong increase in those extremely hot days over the last decades. And that lands in Curtin Springs in the Northern Territories. Data on the x-axis running from the late 1950s in this case through to 2010. And on the y-axis again, the number of days greater than 40 degrees Celsius per year. And here in Africa, data from Southern Africa, from Uppington and from Fixvlei, which are both areas close by to where we work. We see again from the 1960s to 2010s on the x-axis, and number of days exceeding 40 degrees Celsius on the y-axis. And so in all these cases, all around the world, you can see that although temperatures vary from year to year, over the past several decades, we've seen this steady and ongoing increase in numbers of hot days and also in average annual temperatures in our hot deserts globally. So what does this mean for our birds? Well, what we've been focusing on in this research program, me and Andrew and also Phil Hockey, is trying to understand how these rising temperatures influence population persistence of birds globally. So in essence, this is a conservation research program. We're trying to understand the mechanisms linking rising temperatures to changes in bird populations. And we think that those relationships look something like this. So here we've got relationships between rising temperatures and bird behaviour, rising temperatures and bird physiology. interactions between those two aspects of bird biology, and these things influencing survival and reproduction, which then influence population persistence. And so our core aim again is to understand by what mechanisms are birds vulnerable or perhaps resilient to climate change. And by understanding these, we hope that we can understand which species are likely to be most at risk, and also gain some insights into what, if anything, we can do to help. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on these areas of our research: the relationships between temperature and behaviour and physiology, their interactions with one another, and the impacts on survival and reproduction. All right, so thermal environments in arid zones are harsh. These are difficult places to live. For example, in the Kalahari deserts, air temperature on a summer's day can exceed 40 degrees Celsius, but can be lower than -10 degrees on a winter's night. So the most critical part of surviving in such extreme environments is the ability to maintain a safe and a fairly stable body temperature in the face of these temperature extremes. So maintaining stable body temperatures under such conditions is obviously quite difficult. I mean, we know this instinctively that this is the case from our own experience, but it is helpful for the rest of the talk if we do a quick reminder about precisely why this is, which has a lot to do with how heat flows in the environment. So basically, one of the rules of the universe is that heat energy always moves downhill, that is, from hotter places to adjoining cooler places. So we could use a cup of tea and an ice cream to illustrate this. So once you've boiled the kettle and steeped the tea bag, your average nice hot cup of tea is going to be around 70 degrees Celsius when you serve it. And an ice cream that's come fresh out of a shop freezer could be as cold as -12. So let's have a think about what happens to ice creams and cups of tea on an average Cape Town day, which is not today. I mean, you've heard already about how wild it is out there. But normally around 23 degrees Celsius, let's say, on an average Cape Town day. So we all know what happens if we accidentally leave our cup of tea out and forget to drink it. It goes cold because heat energy radiates downhill from that cup of tea into the colder environment. Conversely, the ice cream under the same conditions is going to warm up and melt as heat energy moves in from the warmer environment. So that's pretty straightforward, really. We all know about that. But there is one more thing about heat exchange that's really important to remember, and that's that the rates or the speed at which heat energy is transferred depends on how big the difference in temperature is between the object and the environment. So people often describe this as how steep the gradient is, which becomes intuitive if we think about this as heat flowing downhill. So let's take our hot Kalahari summer day scenario with an air temperature of around 40 degrees Celsius. So under these conditions, the gradient for heat transfer between the cup of tea and the environment is much smaller. So your cup of tea is going to take a lot longer to cool down, stay hot for quite a lot longer than it would on a 23-degree day in Cape Town. And for your ice cream, well, obviously that's just a disaster. So now spare a thought for our little sociable weaver on the slide here, trying to maintain a body temperature of around 42 degrees in the face of these wild fluctuations in air temperature that it's exposed to in its Kalahari environment. Of course, as a living animal, there are some differences between a sociable weaver and a cup of tea. For example, a bird produces metabolic heat through the chemical processes associated with being alive, and it can increase the amount of water it evaporates to help it cool down. So it has some control over this process, just as we do, and we'll explore this further in a moment. We've actually got some real-life data from real-life sociable weavers on how well sociable weavers manage to control their body temperature. And in fact, this graph here is the body temperature trace of the exact individual whose picture is there on the slide, not the glamorous Michelle Thompson whose data this is, but in fact, the sociable weaver, green under William over blue, standing on a perch in the bottom right-hand corner. Okay, so here is the body temperature trace of our sociable weaver over 3 days during the summer of 2014 in the Kalahari. You can see that there is a daily body temperature cycle with the bird maintaining a lower body temperature at night. So this is normal. That saves energy while the bird is sleeping. And you're doing this too. At night, your body temperature is lower than it is during the day. But during the day, our sociable weaver is regulating body temperature at around 42 degrees Celsius, with a range of ups and downs that are associated, for example, with activity, showing much more flexibility of body temperature than we would normally do as humans. But the important thing here is that this bird is never allowing its body temperature to go much above 44 or much below 41. So how is it doing it? What's it doing physiologically to make this possible? Okay, so the next couple of slides are endotherm thermal physiology 101. And it's always terrifying presenting these when Andrew is in the room, because obviously this is his field and I'm always a little bit intimidated that maybe I'm going to get it wrong. But I'm going to do my best, and luckily he's here to correct me if I do mess up. So the key thing here is that endotherms, like birds and like you and I, have a really remarkable ability to regulate our body temperature physiologically. And one of the ways that we do this is by altering metabolic rates to change the rates of body heat production. And so what you're seeing on the graph here is air temperature or environmental temperature on the x-axis and the metabolic rate of the bird on the y-axis. And you can see that there's this strongly non-linear relationship there, where the bird has a high metabolic rate when it's cold, and then a range of temperatures over which the metabolic rate is low and stable. And that's called the thermoregulation zone. And then you've got metabolic rate rising again on the other side when things get hotter. Okay, so it's increasing metabolism partly by shivering at the cold end. And then you've got this really, I mean, it's counterintuitive, right? Why is metabolism going up again when it's hot? What's going on there, and why would a bird want to do that? Well, it seems possible that part of the reason that metabolism increases when air temperature or environmental temperature increases is because the bird is now in a situation where it needs to start evaporating water in order to bring the body temperature down and maintain that safe and stable body temperature. And this is especially important when air or environmental temperatures start to go above 40 degrees, start to approach or exceed the body temperature of the bird. And so here's our evaporative water loss curve here. And you can see that as air temperatures or environmental temperatures start to approach and exceed that body temperature, the rate of evaporative water loss absolutely skyrockets. And that happens because if you recall our cup of tea and our ice cream, when the environmental temperature is similar to the body temperature of the bird, it's going to be really difficult to lose heat passively to the environment. And actually, as environmental temperature begins to go above the body temperature of the bird, heat from the environment is actually going to flow into the bird's body, because the body is then the cooler object in that relationship. So that's why we see these enormous increases in rates of evaporative water loss, because at that point, evaporating water is actually the only way to bring your body temperature down again. You can't rely on that gradient for heat transfer anymore. And so part of the reason why metabolism counterintuitively might start to go up there is because birds have to do something to increase that rate of evaporative water loss, and that doing something generates body heat as well. All right, so why would you go to all this physiological effort in order to maintain a stable body temperature? Why not just let your body temperature rise? It would be easier. But the reason that animals do this is because there's a really important relationship between body temperature and the ability of the body to perform, to do things. So anything you can think of, the ability of an animal to run fast, the ability of it to metabolize its food, the ability of it to anything really that you can think of, is at least in part dictated by body temperature. That's because of the relationship between enzyme activity and all sorts of other things that Andrew can explain to you at length, I think, if you ask him, and temperature. So temperature is a fundamental driver of biological processes. So the critical thing to note here is this non-linear relationship with this really pronounced peak in performance across quite a narrow range of body temperatures. And that's your tolerable range that your bird is really trying hard to stay within all the time. For birds, that's usually around the region of 40 degrees Celsius. You can see that performance declines as body temperatures start to get colder, and eventually declines all the way to zero, where your animal is dead. You can also see that performance declines at hot temperatures. And in fact, it declines much faster when your body temperature gets too hot. And that's associated with things like changes in structure of your enzymes that mean they can't function properly anymore. And things like changes in the structure of your cell membranes, which mean they can't function properly anymore. So that can happen very, very quickly. And so much so that this steep decline in performance at high temperatures has been called the thermal cliff. So what happens when you fall off the thermal cliff? Well, it isn't good. And I guess there should be a trigger warning on this slide, because what happens if you fall off the thermal cliff is fatal. So these two pictures here are both from Australia and both from the last couple of decades, around 2010, both of them, I think, in fact, when there were mass mortality events in Australia associated with extremely hot weather conditions, days well into the 40 degrees Celsius. The top left-hand picture is a whole lot of Carnaby's black cockatoos, which died in a heat wave near Perth. And the bottom right-hand picture, it isn't leaves under that bush. Those are the bodies of budgies. And this was a mass mortality event that occurred in the outback of Australia, where air temperatures exceeded 45 degrees and knocked out all of these birds because they fell off the thermal cliff. So for a long time, we thought that this was something that happened in Australia and it wasn't something that happened here in Africa. But last November, a mass mortality event of this nature occurred at the Pongolo Nature Reserve in northern KZN on a Sunday, on the 8th of November, when air temperatures exceeded 45 degrees. And the field rangers of the Pongolo Nature Reserve started to notice that the birds were falling out of the sky. All right, so it's clear that thermal physiology of birds is really important in terms of understanding how they can cope or not cope with high air temperatures, high and increasing air temperatures, and increasing rates and frequencies and intensities of heat waves under climate change. So one of the core themes of the Hot Birds Research Project has been understanding that thermal physiology. And this is a major focus of Andrew McKechnie's team's work over the last decade. So starting in 2015, Andrew's team have been investigating temperature tolerance limits in bird species from the arid zones of Australia, South Africa, and the USA. And they've worked with at least, at minimum, more now, I think 56 species of birds across those 3 hot deserts, and published a whole series of papers called Avian Thermoregulation, Journal of Experimental Biology. The first of these papers was by Maxine Whitfield here on the slide, who set the standard for the other papers that followed. So these papers were recently, earlier this year, summarized by Andrew in a big review, drawing together everything that his team has discovered since that original work by Maxine in 2015. And in this whole series of work, Andrew and his team were looking for patterns that can help us predict the vulnerability of birds to extreme heat. So this is Maxine's original paper in red there, and then Andrew's final review this year in blue. So here's Maxine and also her husband, Ben Smith, who's an associate professor at Rhodes University now, working in the field lab, collecting these data from birds. And so what Andrew's team have been doing in order to collect thermal physiology data is capturing birds in the field and putting them in a respirometry chamber, which is illustrated here. So in the bottom corner of the slide, you can see an owl sitting in a little plastic box with some tubes coming out of it. So that little plastic box, you can also see in the top right-hand picture, we're looking directly down at it. What you can see in there is the inside of a cool box with a little plastic chamber for our bird to sit in. We've got a copper coil there that allows the students and Andrew to control exactly the temperature inside of that cool box. And you can also see a little infrared lamp there, which we use to keep an eye on the bird. So what you do in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see our cool box again with the bird on during a respirometry run. So from the point of view of the bird, this is not as scary as it looks. So they get put into their little box, the lid goes onto the chamber, and suddenly the bird is sitting there in the dark, and they tend to settle down quite quickly into those conditions. And then the team changes the temperature in the box slowly. And in those through those plastic tubes, they're pumping in air with a known quantity of oxygen and water vapor and carbon dioxide, and then they're measuring the quantity of those molecules in the airstream that's coming out of the box. And using some very clever mathematics, they can then convert the difference in the chemical composition of the air going in versus coming out of the box to calculate metabolic rates and also evaporative water loss rates of the bird in the box. So it's all that all sounds very high tech, but as you can see in the field lab, it's an exciting thing to try and do. And then at the end of the respirometry run, the birds are released back where they were caught. So it's all very ethically clean, this process. All right, so what data can we pull out of this? I'm just going to highlight 3 or 4 species that I think are really interesting from Andrew's now very extensive data collection. And the first of these is the sociable weaver. And the sociable weaver is here to represent passerine songbirds. So passerines use a method of evaporating water called panting. They do this by opening the beak, as you can see the bird here doing, and breathing quite heavily across the respiratory surfaces, so the moist surfaces of the beak, the mouth, and the throat. And by doing so, they can increase their rates of evaporative water loss, as you see in the graph here. So on the x-axis there, we've got the temperature in the respirometry chamber. So that's ambient temperature across the x-axis and evaporative water loss rates on the y-axis there. And again, you can see that really non-linear relationship where as temperatures start to exceed body temperature, the rates of evaporative water loss go up dramatically. Okay, so the next bird I want to highlight is the Namakwa dove. This is a superb little dove that lives in the arid zones of southern Africa. And this species, again, we can have a look at the data here that Andrew's team collected with ambient temperature on the x-axis and the rates of evaporative water loss shown, blue dots there. And again, you see that non-linear relationship. As air temperatures start to exceed 40 degrees, the bird is pumping out water much more rapidly than before. But the dove is doing this in a slightly different way from the weaver. So the dove belongs to the Columbidae family, and they evaporate most of their water cutaneously, so across the surface of the skin, rather than relying on panting alone. And then the third species that I want to show you is the rufous-cheeked nightjar here. And nightjars use gula flutter. So what they do is they open the beak and vibrate the floor of that enormous gape that you can see in the inset photograph there. And by vibrating the floor of the mouth, they're able to really increase the efficiency by which they're able to evaporate water. And here's the water loss curve of our nightjar here. Okay, so each of these methods of evaporating water carries with it a physiological correlate to do with the energy that the bird actually has to spend to make that evaporation happen. And if we look at the sociable weaver, these black dots here show you it's the metabolic heat that it's producing as the ambient temperature changes in that laboratory chamber. Just highlighting with the red arrow 48 degrees Celsius. At 48 degrees, if we look at the difference between metabolic heat produced on the black line and the evaporative loss in the blue line, you can see that these birds are able to dissipate a remarkable 200% of the metabolic heat that they're producing using evaporation via panting. When Andrew and Maxine first told me about this, I thought this was pretty amazing. I'd never had any experience with how this worked before, and I was blown away by that. 200% of body heat produced evaporated using water. I thought that was pretty cool. But then, before I go on, I should let you know that this evaporative water loss efficiency allows sociable weavers to tolerate air temperatures in the lab, so ambient temperatures, up to 52 degrees Celsius, which I also thought was pretty awesome. But then Andrew showed me the data from the Namakwa doves. The Namakwa doves achieve this amazing cutaneous evaporation with hardly any increase in metabolic heat production at all, such that at 48 degrees, they're managing to dissipate 450% of the metabolic heat that they're producing, which allows them to tolerate ambient temperatures in the lab up to 60 degrees Celsius. which blew my mind and which was at the time a world record. But then Andrew's team started working with nightjars, and nightjars are even more remarkable. They are able to dissipate 500% or more of the metabolic heat that they're producing at ambient temperatures, 48 degrees, allowing them to tolerate ambient temperatures over 60. Again, I thought this was remarkable, and it took the world record away from the Namakwa. And just when you thought that you'd heard it all, Andrew starts working with sandgrass and discovers that Namakwa sandgrass are able to offload 550% of metabolic production using evaporative water loss, allowing them again to tolerate temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius, which might explain why these birds manage to survive in such incredibly hot and arid environments. All right, so now that we've got data for over 50 species of birds from arid zones around the world, what can we say about which types of species are most chilled birds in the world? And it's very clear from the data that Andrew and his team has collected that it isn't the songbirds, it's not the passerines like our sociable. Other groups of birds like the doves and the nightjars are much better at tolerating high ambient temperatures than passerines are. And this seems to be related to that relationship between evaporative heat loss and metabolic heat production. So how efficient they are at evaporating water. This graph here I've pulled directly from that review paper that Andrew has just published this year. And in here you can see that the nightjars in red and the doves in green are much more efficient at evaporating water and reducing body temperature than the passerines in blue are. And that low evaporative cooling efficiency of passerines translates to low heat tolerance limits as well. And if we return to that mortality event that happened in Pongolo later last year, about this time last year, and have a look at which birds are actually represented there, there's actually only one species in this whole slide that isn't a passerine. If you can spot it, let us know what it was. All right, so is it therefore better to be, for example, a dove than a passerine in a warming environment? Well, the answer might depend partly on the availability of water, but there's another important consideration as well. So all of the data that I've presented so far were collected in a laboratory or a captive setting. But wild birds don't spend their lives sitting in respirometry chambers, obviously. Wild birds operate in the real world. And in the real world, behaviour mediates the relationship between climate and physiology. And I think we can illustrate that fairly clearly if we have a look at these photographs here. The one on the left is taken with an ordinary camera. The one on the right taken at the same time with a thermal imaging camera at an air temperature of 38 degrees. If you look at the thermal image, you can see that in this environment in which a wild bird is operating, the actual temperatures that are available to it are ranging quite widely. The scale bar on the side of that thermal image ranges from 26 degrees in the dark blue through to 50 in the white. So you can see that even when air temperature is 38 degrees, the thermal landscape is much more complex than that. So this means that wild birds can use the landscape to manage the heat load that they're experiencing. They can change the amount of thermal stress that they're under by using behaviour to modify where they are in the environment. So your heat load comes from the temperature of the environment that you're exposed to, plus your own metabolic heat production. Your heat load isn't really captured particularly well by the weather reports or the weather presenter telling you it's 30 degrees today. And that's because the temperature that you're actually experiencing, the environmental temperature or the operative temperature, is a combination of microclimatic conditions. It's not just air temperature alone. For example, a bird that's sitting on a branch here on a 30-degree day is going to be experiencing a temperature that's influenced by the air temperature, of course, but also by the wind speed and the location where it's sitting, by the solar radiation it's exposed to, by humidity, by the radiation from the ground, for example. And what that means, as we saw in the thermal image, is that locations within the landscape that differ in terms of microclimate conditions differ also in terms of the temperature that you're going to experience as an animal in the landscape. So for example, a bird sitting on a branch in a tree in the shade in the wind is going to feel a lot cooler than a bird sitting on the ground in the sun, okay? And we can actually measure these or estimate them using black globe data loggers. So these are like little thermal models. They're made of copper. It's a hollow copper sphere. Inside, we've got a temperature data logger, and the whole thing is painted black. And we can place these out in the environment and use them to estimate the sorts of temperatures that a small bird is going to experience in those given locations. So here are some real data that we collected using black globe thermometers at midday during summer in the Kalahari at air temperatures of 37 degrees. These are the temperatures that we actually measured on that day. And as you can see, they range enormously from 41 degrees on the branch of the tree down to 65 on the ground. So it's a temperature gradient of over 20 degrees in the same small thermal landscape, the same really constrained area at the same air temperature of 37. What this means is that shade-seeking behaviour can enormously reduce the heat load to which birds are exposed, and therefore enormously reduce the physiological costs in terms of metabolic heat production and evaporative water loss that they're paying in order to maintain safe body temperatures in the environment. So birds and other animals, ourselves included, use behavioural strategies to keep on hot weather. And some of the most visible behaviours that birds use to keep cool are these three that I've illustrated on the slide here. Seeking shade, we've just gone in depth into why that matters. Reducing activity, which reduces metabolic heat production. And of course, panting to facilitate evaporative cooling, especially if you're a passerine bird like the sociable weaver on the slide. And the data actually in these graphs, again, are collected from this exact individual sociable weaver who's pictured on the slide here. But thermoregulatory effort doesn't come for free, and the costs of keeping cool associated with these behaviours can also be high. So panting, of course, carries a risk of dehydration, which is a physiological cost. But all three of these behaviours carry costs in terms of missed opportunities. So missed opportunity costs, they're often underestimated or overlooked, and they're associated with the fact that it's really hard to do two behaviours at the same time. For example, seeking shade might take you into an area where foraging is less efficient. So we've been trying to understand these costs and consequences of changes in behaviour for thermoregulation across a number of different species. So we're slowly building up a bank of focal species studies to understand these and to understand what it is that might drive differences in the costs of keeping cool between different species. I'm just going to show you data from a few of these on this for the next few slides. The first species I want to talk to you about is the southern fiscal, which is a species that I really like. This is the bird that I worked with for the first couple of years after I moved to South Africa. So the graph on the slide here shows you the different types of perches that southern fiscals like to use when they're hunting. So you may be familiar with this bird, or you might not be. It is a shrike. It's a true shrike, so it's related to loggerhead shrikes in the US. It's related to great grey shrikes in Europe. It's related to lesser grey shrikes, which are common to both Europe and Africa, so they migrate between the two places. And because it's a shrike, it likes to find high exposed perches to hunt from, because its hunting strategy involves looking around for prey that are moving on the ground to pounce down on. And so it's really important for this bird to have a good field of view for hunting. So the picture here shows you low perches with the L, high perches with the H, sun and shade. And the y-axis of the graph tells you about the preference of these birds for using these perches. So anything below zero means those types of perches in the environment are generally avoided by the birds. Anything above zero indicates that they're preferred perches. So the blue box plot here tells you what these shrikes that I was working with back in 20 2010 and 2011 were preferring to do on a normal day, and that was very strongly preferring to be on high sunny perches, which are good places to forage from. But this changes dramatically when air temperatures go above 35 degrees Celsius. Then the birds begin to avoid those high sunny perches and shift their preference for high perches in the shade. And this is a really important behavioural strategy, because the temperatures that we were recording on those high shaded perches were greater than 4 degrees cooler than the high sunny perches. So these birds were making enormous savings in terms of water costs by shifting in the environment like that. However, it didn't come for free. That's because those high shaded perches are not as good for foraging, because they tend to be surrounded by vegetation, so the view isn't as good. And the prey capture rate per minute of these birds from a shaded perch is less than half of that from a sunny perch. Now, the birds that I was working with were breeding, and this change in foraging efficiency translated directly to a change in provisioning rates, such that on cool days they were taking a lot more food to the nest than they were on hot days. And this had knock-on effects on the ability of the chicks to grow. So on the x-axis of this graph, we've got the air temperature maximum. On the y-axis, we've got the percent body mass gain of a tiny little fiscal shrike chick between dawn and dusk. And you can see that on cool days, these little baby shrikes were growing putting on about 40% body mass between dawn and dusk. Whereas on hot days approaching 40 degrees, they were lucky if they managed to put on 10%. Now, these effects of hot days during the nesting period carry over to the quality or the size of the chicks when they fledge from the nest, so when they leave the nest to become independent. And they also carry over to how long it takes for these fiscal shrike chicks to get big enough to get out of the nest and to be able to fly. So if we look at these two graphs here, on the x-axis, we've got the temperature data, which tell us the impact of a single day during the nestling period between hatch and fledge, on which air temperatures exceeded the temperature indicated on the graph. So if we look at this one here, what this is telling us is the impact of one day over 35 degrees on the fledging date of these chicks. So for every day that exceeded 35 degrees during the nestling period, these chicks were taking half a day longer to fledge. Okay, so hopefully that clarifies what these graphs are about. And this is really important because each additional day in the nest carries a 4% increase in predation risk for the species at the study site that we're working in. So this has a direct effect on survival and breeding success. So in this case, we've got this route from shade seeking by the adult birds to lost foraging success by those breeding adults to lower breeding success. And the second species I want to quickly talk to you about is the southern yellow-billed hornbill. So this is work by my PhD student, Tanya van der Ven. What you can see in the picture here is a hornbill sitting on a nest box, but you can see this funny metal device on the nest box, which is a load cell measuring the body mass of that bird. What Tanya found is that as air temperatures increase, hornbills spend an increasing proportion of their time panting. And also, they shift from their preferred foraging sites in the ground and the sun into shady locations in trees. This is important because when a hornbill starts panting, its ability to catch prey really declines dramatically. So again, we see this relationship between a behavioural change for thermoregulation and the ability for the bird to get food. And what's happening here is that it's really hard to hold your beak open to pants and also to pick up big prey items of the kind that hornbills like. In addition, the foraging success of these birds is much lower in trees than it is on the ground. And taken together, these mean that as air temperatures increase, foraging success of hornbills declines. And once again, this translates to reduced provisioning rates to nests. And also, using those load cells on the nest box, we could measure that this is translating to reduced ability of those breeding birds to actually maintain their own body mass. So as air temperatures get hotter, it's harder and harder for hornbills to maintain a stable body mass during the day. And indeed, when air temperatures exceed about 36.5 degrees, these birds are starting to lose weight. So here we have a relationship between a thermoregulatory change in behaviour, which is associated with loss of foraging opportunities, associated with lost provisioning rates and lost mass of adults. And as with the fiscal shrikes, this translates to impacts on the chicks as well. So here we have temperature during the nesting period on the x-axis and the probability that these birds will actually manage to fledge even one chick out of their nest on the y-axis. And here we have the size, the mass, so the weight of those chicks when they do leave the nest. You can see that as air temperatures get hotter, the birds are getting lighter and lighter, so those babies are leaving the nest smaller and smaller. So in this case, we found that 35 degrees was a critical threshold above which the chances that a hornbill was going to breed successfully dropped below 50%. And indeed, these small light chicks really struggle after they. Three smallest birds on this graph all died within a couple of days of fledging. So here we have our thermoregulatory trade-offs associated with the birds trying to keep cool, translating all the way through to loss of breeding success again. So one of the really interesting and more recent things we've been able to do with these data is to try to partition the cost of high temperatures on nesting success in birds by looking at how much of this effect the temperature effect on the ability of chicks to survive and actually successfully leave the nest is mediated through high temperatures having direct physiological costs on their babies, and how much is mediated through changes in provisioning rates, so behavioural changes by the parent birds. In the case of the yellow-billed hornbills, about 30% of nestling mass gain between the chicks hatching and chicks fledging is attributable to these changes in provisioning rates. And about 70% of the temperature effect on nesting mass gain is direct by the impacts of air temperature on the temperature in the nest. And this is really useful data, because if we know where the problem is, we can start to think up management interventions to help. So this pattern of compromised foraging as air temperatures rise is really consistent across species. The critical temperatures that we keep finding in our research are in the mid-30 degrees Celsius, and we see consistently birds losing body mass at air temperatures above those mid-30s, and compromised breeding success, again coming up at air temperatures above those mid-30s. So the last bird I'm going to talk to you this evening is the fork-tailed drongo, which is a bit of a maverick, a bit of a surprise. So we were doing the same sort of work with fork-tailed drongos as we were with the hornbills and the tablets. And what we were trying to understand here is whether these missed foraging opportunities, so these declines in foraging success as air temperature rises, are due to temperature effects on the birds themselves. So due to those foraging thermoregulation trade-offs, due to the birds changing their behaviour in order to try and keep cool, whether they were due perhaps to something else, perhaps changes in prey availability in the environment as air temperatures rise. It's an important thing to try and untangle so that we know where the mechanism is that's driving these changes. And we worked with habituated drongos at Kuraman River Reserve, and you can see how fabulously tractable these birds are in the images of my colleagues Tom Flower and Ryan Otlinger here on the slide. So what we did here is we actually worked with trained birds and supplied them with mealworms, which we did by flinging the worm in the air so that the bird would fly out and catch it. I'm going to try and play that for you again. There we go. Okay, so we were flinging worms at drongos and measuring how many of them they were actually willing to fly for as air temperatures got hotter and hotter. So by doing this, we're keeping that prey availability constant and actually able to measure the impact of temperature on the ability of these birds to forage. And what we found is that as temperature increases, the number of worms that the birds were simply refusing to fly for also went up, which tells us that birds are beginning to refuse to fly as temperature increases. They don't want to take on that metabolic load. And that means that thermoregulatory costs are directly influencing foraging. It's not just about changes in the availability of insects in the environment. We also looked at what the birds did with the prey that they caught and found that as temperatures increased, they ate more of those worms themselves and took less of them to the nest to feed their chicks, which shows us that thermoregulatory costs are directly influencing the provisioning rates of the chicks. So the surprise with the drongos is what happened next. So with all the other species that we'd worked with, we'd identified these kinds of relationships between temperature and foraging success, temperature and provisioning, and those were translating to smaller and lighter chicks that were fledging less successfully. But when we looked at the chick data from the drongos, this is what we found. So for drongos, somehow they're escaping the thermal trap. Somehow mean temperature during the nest period, although it's affecting the behavior of the adult birds and affecting the amount of food that's going into these chicks, isn't affecting the mass at which they're leaving the nest. And we still don't know how they do it. Okay, so what we know so far, we know that birds have built-in mechanisms to cope with the heat. We know that they have more flexible body temperatures than we do. We know that they're able to avoid the thermal cliff through many species like doves managing to maintain low metabolic rates at high air temperatures and using efficient evaporative cooling, especially doves and sandgrouse nightjars. We also know that they're using the landscape and altering activity patterns to keep cool. But we know that these changes in behavior don't come for free. We know that hypothermia risks lowered performance, lowered physiological performance at the tame end. We know that even efficient evaporative coolers potentially face immense challenges in terms of water balance, especially in deserts, as many of these superstar birds that are hugely good at evaporating water rely on drinking that water from surface water sources. We know that behavioural adjustments have the potential to reduce survival and breeding success over the longer term, even if they're increasing survival very in the term. So we know that desert birds live life in a fine balance, and we can see from the data that we've collected so far that climate change is likely to tip this balance up. So what can we do? Well, in our research, we're trying to understand how some species manage to escape the thermal trap, if indeed they do so. Sorry, my internet just slowed down there a little bit. So we're working hard with the drongos to try and understand how it is they're managing to raise these big healthy chicks despite facing all these behavioural costs, thermoregulation. We're working really hard now with red-listed species like the southern ground hornbill to understand the mechanisms by which climate change, by which temperature is affecting their success. So trying to break apart how much is due to behavioural changes in adults, how much is due to resource availability in the environment, how much is due to nest temperatures. Because if we can tease apart statistically where the problems are coming in, we'll be able to develop more effective mitigation for those critical red list species. We're also mapping these thermal thresholds in the mid-30s across the ranges of the bird species we work with, because by doing so, using climate change models, we can begin to plan for the future. So in this slide here, we've got work by our PhD student, Shannon Conradi, showing the area across Southern Africa where average summer maximum temperatures are exceeding 35 degrees now and in the future. What you can see in the right-hand graph here is that the rate of warming across Southern Africa isn't uniform. And within the range of southern yellow-billed hornbills, we do have a couple of little pockets where even in 2080, we expect that average summer air temperatures are going to be below that critical threshold. And that tells us that those are the areas where we really should be focusing, for example, our conservation efforts for the species. So the current and future directions of our work are to continue to try and link behaviour and physiology in the same free-ranging individuals so that we can better understand exactly how those two aspects of mechanistic responses to heat interrelate to affect fitness in the same individuals. We're beginning to trial practical management interventions to try to assess what we can do to actually help, given that we are facing rampant global heating. We're moving into new climate zones, out of the arid zone and into more mesic areas to try to understand the impacts of humidity on these temperature relationships. And I put the blue wax bill on the slide here because we hope that this will be the first species that we integrate both behavioural and physiological data on the responses of birds to heat and humidity combined. And we're developing new modelling techniques that allow us to reach accurate answers faster, so that we don't have to spend years with each species understanding its relationships with temperature and its likely costs under climate change. We're working with a range of amazing, fantastic up-and-coming scientists to do this work. So we're still learning a lot about the thermal biology of birds. With every study that we do, we learn something new and surprising. But the situation is critical. And so our focus now in the Hot Birds research team is increasingly going to be on applied conservation. Right, I think I'm out of time, but I'm also out of slides. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'd be happy to chat with you a bit further if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Susie. Marty is not disappointing this evening. He's got a question, so I'm going to ask you to unmute, Marty, and you can ask Susan your question.
Cool. Thanks, Susan, for a very interesting talk and quite complicated slides with averages and extremes and things. So yeah, it was very interesting to try and make sure we understood everything, to be honest. But it's very interesting. I was just kind of thinking, you know, as you were going through, what about the ground-based birds? Surely they getting the worst of everybody because they're right by the 65 degrees. Maybe they've got slightly longish legs, but there's actually an amazing amount of birds that are based on the ground, like a whole lot of the larks and things like that, which are literally on the ground. And then to make it even worse, there's some ground-based birds that are nesting on the ground, and they sit in the full sun the whole day while they're trying to look after their eggs and things like that. And then just another example, an ostrich, which has got a massive body and less surface area to get rid of the heat. So I was just wondering if you maybe wanted to chat about some of those species. And then the last sort of comment is that fork-tailed drongo was almost completely counterintuitive. He's black and he's got a better deal. So talk about how much the color affects their thermal story. Thanks, sir.
Oh, thanks, Marty. That's, I mean, such wonderful ideas. Really, that's amazingly insightful, and these are the things that we think about too. I mean, it's, yeah, I'm really thanks very much. And I hope that the graphs were not too dire. I do try to keep them fairly accessible, but I know it's technical, so we're very happy to clarify anything. Where to start? Shall I start at the end and work backwards? Fork-tailed drongos are black, and yet they seem to manage. Yeah, it's amazingly counterintuitive, that, isn't it? Plumage colors are a tricky thing, and to try and understand in terms of heat exchange and thermal balance, because it's not as straightforward as being dark colored means that you're going to be hotter. And part of the reason for that is because there's a layer of air between the surface of the feathers and the skin. And so a dark colored bird is not quite the same as being a dark colored lizard, where the color of the skin is the color of the skin. This is the feathers. And birds can erect the feathers or flatten them in terms of, you know, balancing thermoregulation. They can also move in the landscape. And so one of the things that a dark colored bird can do is go up to the top of the tree and stand in the wind and then raise its feathers a little bit. And this is really amazingly helpful because dark feathers block a lot of the sunlight from reaching the skin itself. They absorb a lot of heat into the surface of the feather. And then if you go up and stand in the wind, then the wind can blow that heat out of the feathers before it reaches the skin. And if the wind is strong enough, if it's, I think the threshold is somewhere around 7 meters per second. But if the wind if the breeze is stiff enough, then you can actually be cooler as a dark colored bird on the top of a tree than a light colored bird would be. Wow. So it's surprisingly counterintuitive. So maybe part of the drongo's trick is in fact dark colored, who knows. We're still working on how they're managing to pull off this amazing feat. What else was there? Ground nesting birds, ground dwelling birds. Yes, that's a thermally and challenging environment, absolutely. And we would expect that ground dwelling birds might be facing stronger behavioral thermoregulatory trade-offs than some of the other more arboreal species because of having more shuttling to do between sun and shade and having a narrower, increasingly squeezed thermal windows. We don't have enough data on the behavior of the ground dwelling birds yet to really nail that, but I suspect that you might be onto something there. Then body size, another really tricky thing, difficult to get your head around. Is it better to be small or large? That's tough. And there's a lot of data that suggests birds might be shrinking in arid zones as the climate warms. So there's data from Australia and from Israel that suggests that there might be a sort of a general shrinking going on as it gets warmer. But it's unclear whether that pattern is being driven by an adaptive response to the hot weather. Like smaller birds are doing better because of their ability to, having a larger surface area to volume ratio, so being able to offload heat to the environment faster, or whether what's happening is actually driven by the kinds of patterns I was talking about with fiscal shrikes and with the hornbills, that smaller birds are fledging smaller because they're actually nutritionally stunted in the nest. So actually what we might be seeing is lower quality birds coming into populations. And there's some work done by Andrew and my colleague Janet in Australia that suggests that as the climate warms, the summers get hotter, but the winters also get warmer. And that means that these little birds that would normally not make it through the winter because they're lower quality and they're small are actually surviving through the winter because the winter is warmer. And so that could be driving this small birds scenario. It's very complicated, hey? The other thing to think about is that surface area to volume ratios is double-edged sword. So being small is good when it's hot, so long as it's not hotter than you. So as long as your body temperature is higher than surrounding environment, you've got that gradient for heat transfer. And then being small is going to improve your rates of heat loss to the environment because of surface area to volume ratios. But as environmental temperatures get higher than body temperature, being small becomes a liability because that surface area, that big surface area, means you're going to pick up heat from the environment rapidly. So then we would expect bigger birds to have an advantage. So what we might see, if this pattern of body size is adaptive, we might see birds that are getting smaller now start to get bigger again as climate change progresses. All right, so hopefully that's all the threads.
Thanks for the answers.
Thank you for the really insightful questions.
Thank you, Marty. If there are any other people in the room that would like to ask Susan a question, please go to your control bar. There's an area where it says reactions, and you can put your hand up there, and I will unmute you or ask you to unmute, and then you can ask your question. But seeing as there is nobody asking questions at this point in time, I have here's one from Matthew Church. I'm going to ask you to unmute, Matthew.
Oh, thanks for the talk. Obviously, areas like the Kalahari Air are heating up massively, and lots of these birds have strongholds in those kind of areas. What kind of practical measures, conservation measures, can you actually do over such large territories in areas where they are actually heating up so much? Or is it just a case of conserving them on the edges, kind of as they're moving south?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a hard one to answer. Across big areas, the main thing that we can do is actually do what we can to get political and reduce carbon emissions, right? So in the big picture, we need to do something about climate warming. But in the interim and in restricted areas, perhaps there are mitigations that we can put in place. One of the things that we've been testing recently is providing shade at water points to help birds to actually access the water they need to power their efficient evaporative cooling mechanisms under really hot climate conditions. One of the problems that you face when you come down to the ground to drink, of course, is that the surface temperature of the ground is really, really hot, and you're getting those environmental temperatures into the 60 degrees Celsius on hot days on the ground. And if you've spent any time in the Kalahari, as I know that you have, you know that the water points tend to be really bare around the edge of the water because of livestock or because of game coming to the water. So it's a real problem for a lot of birds accessing water during the heat of the day when potentially they really need it. So one of the things we're trialing is trying to reduce those environmental temperatures at the edge of the water. It seems to work better for small birds than larger ones, but something that we're still on. And then another mitigation that might work for red list species like southern ground hornbills, if we can establish what proportion of that impact on nest success is actually via resource restriction, so via those lower provisioning rates, versus via the temperatures in the nest, then we know where to pinpoint the mitigation for hands-on management of things that are already critically endangered. So for southern ground hornbills, there's a lot of work done to recover that species that relies on provision of nest boxes. So we're working with a student at the moment to work out to what extent improving the insulation of those boxes will improve nest success. And then with the yellow-billed hornbills, we're also working on to what extent providing supplementary food can buffer those high temperature scenarios. So yeah, there's a few things that we can do on the ground, but in the big picture, we really need to deal with this climate change problem.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Susan. Okay, so I've got a question before I go through to Richard, and it's possibly got a connection to what Matthew's question was now, and that is the Hotbirds project. Is it looking at the possible displacement situations? I looked at one of those thermal maps, which pretty much says the Kalahari won't have any yellow-billed hornbills in it. And I find that quite sad in the long run. But I mean, essentially, with those sort of thermal increases happening in those areas, surely you will start to see displacements. And I think we're already seeing it in places like Johannesburg, for example, where you're seeing a lot of the bushveld birds arriving in this treed city of ours.
Yeah, so some of the modelling work that Shannon Conradi has been doing, it's been about trying to understand where birds will still be able to be in the future based on behavioural and physiological thresholds. And that is highlighting areas of birds' ranges where they might persist. It's also highlighting areas where they're likely to disappear, as you pointed out. In terms of understanding when and how birds can move, it's a really highly complex thing. It's not, range shifts aren't just about thermal physiology or behavioural thermal thresholds. They're also about habitat and species interactions as well. And so bushveld birds moving into Pretoria, they couldn't have done that if the trees weren't there in the city, right? So they may or may not be following a thermal envelope or a climate bubble, but they're being facilitated, whatever, by the presence of those trees. And I think another really good example of this kind of thing going on is the situation with the pied crows becoming more common in the Karoo. That seems to be associated with the climate in the Karoo region actually warming into an envelope that suits them. So they like an average annual temperature of 19 degrees, randomly enough. And that's what we're moving into in the Karoo region. But they couldn't do it. They couldn't be there if we hadn't put in roads and power line infrastructure across that landscape, because they're tree nesters. They need a structure to build a nest on them. And we've provided that in the Karoo. And they're moving now, I think, because the climate is becoming suitable now. So some species will be able to track climate envelopes if there are habitat corridors or artificial changes to the landscape that can facilitate it, or if they're extremely generalist and can cope with a wide range of habitat conditions. But other species that are closely associated with things like species that are closely associated with certain types of trees or certain types of dietary requirements, if those habitat requirements, those species interactions aren't found where the climate is suitable, then having a suitable climate further south isn't going to be enough. That makes sense.
Perfect sense. Thanks very much, Susan. Richard Buchholz, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. I'm going to ask you to unmute. He's got a question for you, Susan.
All right, good.
Richard.
Thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering about the drongos being unwilling to eat the mealworms as the temperature went up. Is there any chance part of their reticence comes from the heat produced during the metabolic activity of digestion?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah, and so part of it could be that they're not feeling hungry anymore because they can't afford to, you know, as you say, produce additional metabolic heat to digest the food. And I think that might explain some of the reluctance, but it may not explain all of the reluctance to take food to the nest. So certainly there's another source of metabolic heat, and that's the actual flight to catch the thing and the actual flight to take it to the nest. So both of those may be at play. Yeah.
It would be interesting to look at whether their digestive efficiency changes. I mean, they might want a mealworm for the water that's in the mealworm, but not want to generate the energy required to digest the non-water components.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point. And we've actually got a PhD student in the field at the moment running an experiment looking at willingness to forage for normal mealworms and mealworms that we've actually supplemented with additional water to try to untangle some of those effects.
Great.
So maybe we'll have an answer or some sort of answer for those questions in the future.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thank you, Susan. Susan, I've got a direct message here from Keith Newnham, saying that his mic doesn't work, but he has sent you a direct message asking a question. If you could just read us the question and answer it for us. Thanks.
All right, so Keith's question: evolution says species will adapt to changes in their environment. And is your data suggesting that the rate of change being experienced through human-induced climate change is now threatening the ability of birds in general to evolve at a pace required to keep up with the rate of change? Notwithstanding the superstars, have they always had those abilities? Are there any birds you see that are adapting to the pace of change better than others? Whew, what a good question. And what a difficult one to answer. I mean, I wouldn't say there's no hope, because we do see variation between individuals in our study populations and their ability to handle the heat. And such variation is what selection acts upon, of course. So some of our shrike chicks, for example, cope better than others, even when it's hot. And so there's scope. There's scope for natural selection to work here. That critical question is, are the fitness costs that the populations are experiencing right now is the selection pressure too strong? Are we going to see population collapses before the birds are able to adapt? Are we losing too many individuals? Or will they be able to, is the selection pressure such that those better thermal superstars are able to carry the population through? And I don't know the answer to that. I hope, Keith, that there's enough variation that some of these populations will pull through better and do better than they are now. One of the problems that we have is that this is a selection pressure that is continually getting stronger year after year. So it's not like we've had a step change from a certain range of temperatures to a new range of temperatures, and now the birds must adapt to those. It's a selection pressure that is continuing to intensify. So the risk is that even if we have enough variation now that some birds are surviving and managing to successfully recruit into populations and be good quality individuals, 10 years from now, we're going to be facing temperatures that are X many degrees hotter again. And so it's an ongoing selection drive that I do worry is going to be too much. I don't think any of us can say for sure. And what more can I say? Will that do?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks very much, Susan. Marty has his hand raised again. He's been saving up questions. He didn't ask any questions last week or the week before, so he's got a couple of questions to ask tonight.
No, cool, thanks. I was just thinking as you were busy talking, because there's almost another whole angle to it as well. So it's one thing for the bird itself to not overheat and die, but then there's whatever it might be eating that also needs to survive and be able to provide it with food. So whether that's an insect or a seeds from a plant or whatever. And I mean, you mentioned the passerines, songbirds, which are generally seed eaters, and their relative inability compared to some of the others. But from a food point of view and getting energy, which ones are on a better spot? The things that are eating seeds and grass, or the things that are eating live things? I mean, are the insects booming because of the increased temperature, or the insects also dying?
Yeah, you ask superb questions, Marty. Thanks. Yeah, I mean, species interactions and the consequences of climate change on those it's a huge thing. It's a huge area of unknowns and a huge field of work that needs to be done if we've got time to do it. It's really difficult to say whether a foraging guild or another is going to be more vulnerable based on changes in the availability of their food, because very few species are eating just one thing for a start. And so if you think about insects booming, well, maybe some of them are and others aren't. And so they're going to be like birds as well. Some are going to be more resilient, some are going to be more vulnerable. And so what the birds are eating, the dietary flexibility that the bird has to switch from a prey species that's declining to one that's increasing will matter. And we don't necessarily know how flexible all these different species are. With regard to your seed eaters, are they going to be able to switch seed types if some of the plants are declining and others are increasing? If they can do that, maybe they'll do better than a can't. And so it's difficult. I think the one common thread that you could, or the one prediction that you could make, is that species that are generalist are likely to cope with changes in ecological functioning or changes in the abundance of the species they depend on better than species that are specialist. So that's probably the key thing. But yeah, I think one of the exciting things here is that ecosystems are going to change dramatically in ways that we can't predict. And maybe we need to take the opportunity to try to be excited by that, as well as being really worried about the species. You're muted, Marty, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I was muted. I needed to unmute, and someone has to give me permission. But yeah, I mean, again, even in the short term, some of the insects may become more sluggish and actually easier prey for certain birds as well. So it's kind of a lot of moving parts, so to speak, that will determine the answers.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Just thanks, Marty. Matthew Church has got his hand up again, but I just want to make a comment on that. Lots of moving parts. And surely there's also the concern and correlation with the potential fall off in terms of the insect world. We're seeing these massive declines in insects across the globe with all of our uses in chemicals, etc., etc. And that's going to have a knock-on effect to our bird populations as well, I would imagine. Matthew, I'm asking you to unmute. Go ahead.
Have you looked at larger bird species in like the desert areas, like cory bustards, eagles, other raptors, things like that? And are they behaving the same as the smaller passerines or doves?
Yeah, not so much to date. I mean, most of our work has focused on smaller things, more tractable things to collect data on over the timescales of PhDs and master's projects. Raptors are difficult for a number of reasons. One of them is that they have a escape route available to them, especially the larger ones that the passerines don't, and that's that they can go up. And do go up, so tend to disappear in the heat of the day. So whether that makes them, whether that's going to help them or not, we actually don't know yet. Andrew's been doing some interesting work on scaling of physiological tolerances with body mass that might provide a little bit of insight. I mean, it's difficult though. We see patterns that suggest that physiological tolerances of larger birds might be higher than smaller birds, perhaps because of capacity to have body water to use. I think I'll probably hand over to Andrew to talk more about that if he wishes to. But no, we don't have a lot of comprehensive data on larger species at this stage. That's the short answer. Hopefully the work that we're doing now on ground hornbills and work coming up on vultures and secondary birds might start to provide some.
I see Andrew is unmuted. I don't know if Andrew, if you'd like to come in and weigh in on this.
I was asked to unmute, but yeah, I mean, look, we just haven't had a chance to really work on larger species yet. There's some very, quite significant logistical challenges involved scaling up those metabolic chambers to something the size of a martial eagle or a vulture. But I'm certainly, planning to do some work in the next couple of years on issues like thermal environments in vulture nests, and then increasing heat loads on eggs and nestlings. But at the moment, all of our data are really from species smaller than about 500 grams.
Thanks very much, Andrew. There's a comment here in the comments bar from Holly and Gog saying we've just had 5 vultures die in the Mara of overheating. I don't know if Andrew or Susan would like to make a or weigh in on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting, and I mean, it's a terrible thing, but it's also extremely interesting. I'd like to get, I think we'd both like to speak with Holly about that later if we can, to try and get a handle on the temperature conditions that were happening on that day associated with that.
So we'll get Mariette to put you in touch with Holly so that you've got an answer. Matthew, your hand is still raised. Do you want to continue with the question? Cool. Okay. I don't see any other hands raised. I did see another general comment that I wanted to read out in the bar from Tariq Birisich, saying, fantastic talk and amazing presentation. Thank you so much. I'd really be interested in future work in other biomes such as the humid rainforest. It's going on to what Rod was talking about before we started the talk. Working in upper Guinean rainforests in Liberia now, and potential for collaboration is huge. And thanks again. So if you'd like to explore those options, Mariette will also put you in touch with Tariq. Cool. Are there any other questions in the room? We're getting to that time of the evening where we can potentially allow everybody to unmute, and then we can just have a general conversation. Any last comments, Susan?
Just to say thanks again for the opportunity to chat with you all this evening. It's really been really fun, and yeah, hopefully the talk was all right and you enjoyed it. Thank you.